Hello everybody and welcome to Alan History Nerd. In this video I'm continuing to look at Tudor rebellions, and in particular I'm looking at the social and economic theme. So this essentially is an element of AO1, and what I'm trying to get behind is how important or how significant were social and economic factors in causing the rebellions during the Tudor period. Now this would be one of the themes that you would look at, and you would contrast this with religious causes and political causes. The big picture then, as we look at this period. So the video will examine some of the areas you need to think about when arguing that the key reasons for rebellion and dissent in Tudor England were social and economic issues. Now, the period saw a number of key things that feed into this. The first was a rapidly rising population. This was linked with urbanisation, with the growth of towns, and dissent was more common within towns to some extent. There was often absolutely rampant inflation, and there were also controversial issues such as enclosure and other changes that were taking place in the economy. Now, social and economic distress kind of manifested itself in different ways. Sometimes it was something that was felt across the different levels of society, and in that point the classes would unite against the monarch. And an example of this is the Pilgrimage of Grace. And there were times actually when the different classes were clashing, and this is seen most notably in Kett's Rebellion in 1549. It is also important to note that local issues were often highly significant in these rebellions, and so it wasn't necessarily something that was a social economic issue across the whole of England, but something that might very particularly affect that area. There might be something particularly bad about circumstances at that point in time, or something that causes a large amount of anger. And there was plenty of time in this time period for there to be lots of rumour and misinformation, and therefore people to be protesting and discontent about something that wasn't actually happening or about to happen, but they believed was going to. And this can play a role in why some rebellions grew quicker or more substantially than others. Now, probably the most important, most unpopular area in terms of an economy, if at any point in time, is taxation. Nobody is normally a great fan of this. And therefore, throughout history, we will see taxation as a basis of discontent and rebellion. And it's key in a number of the rebellions. It's key in the Yorkshire and Cornwall rebellions against Henry VII. It's key in the reaction to the amicable grant in 1525 under Henry VIII. It plays a role in the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536. And it plays a role in the Western Rebellion in 1549. Now, during the Tudor period, rather than there being a kind of constant inevitability of taxation, so in the modern world we have things like payee, and the tax just disappears out of our wages before they actually land in our bank. But at this point in time, the taxes weren't a kind of that absolute constant, particularly on things like income. Actually, they were raised specifically at different points in time because a monarch needed money. And there was often a kind of a major link to some big thing that was going, normally an expensive war against a foreign nation. And to kind of carry the burden of these costs, then the monarch wouldn't be able to get this from what was referred to as that ordinary revenue. They had to generate extraordinary revenue. And that extraordinary revenue was often generated through taxation. Taxation of the poor, particularly to pay for things that they didn't see as relevant to them or important, and particularly at times of difficulty, e.g. there'd just been a poor harvest, is always likely to cause discontent and, in extreme cases, lead to rebellion. Now let's look at taxation in relevance to some particular rebellions. So the first one I'm going to look at is the Yorkshire Rebellion in 1489. Now, the primary cause of the Yorkshire Rebellion was clearly taxation. There was a tax raised to pay for a war against France, which is notably not somewhere that would necessarily directly threaten Yorkshire. Other northern counties, to make this worse, had been exempt on the basis of poverty, notably Northumberland, Westmoreland and Cumbria. There was also these are the counties which border Scotland, and so there was concern that they didn't want to take money out of these counties in case they needed to raise troops in these counties to defend against Scottish attack. So Yorkshire felt a bit aggrieved that it was having to pay this tax, whilst the counties above it weren't, whilst it equally felt that it was under no particular threat from France, and also that it also was suffering economically at this point in time. Now, the Earl of Northumberland, Henry Percy, who was put in charge of raising the tax, was killed by the rebels. So we can see here that this direct connection to tax, and so we can make a causal link and therefore quite strongly argue that this is a tax-based rebellion. Another similar rebellion in the reign of Henry VII is the Cornish Rebellion of 1497. Again, this appears to primarily be due to tax. This time it was to pay for a war in Scotland, and quite clearly Scotland is a long way away from Cornwall. So the Cornish, who were suffering economically from various things at this point, didn't see that it was particularly fair or relevant for them to pay a tax to defend against the Scots. And there was also a slightly unusual nature to this tax. It didn't work like taxes had worked before, and therefore this was seen as a reason to kind of reject it and to claim that they were badly done to. And we see the Cornish actually march towards London, and eventually there's a battle at Blackheath. Another tax, and it's similar in terms of a complaint about a tax being unusual, is the amicable grant under Henry VIII. This is an idea that came up by Wolsey, and it kind of breaks one of the fundamental rules in the English system about a king raising a tax, because consent from Parliament was not sought, and so this immediately means this tax is very unpopular. It was also on top of Henry really trying to kind of screw as much money out of the people as he possibly could with forced loans. There were economic problems, especially in the wool industry. There was a shortage of coinage. Essentially, there wasn't enough money in circulation. It targeted both clergy and the laity, so the clergy, those who work in the church, the laity, who were the rest of the population. And it made use of recent assessments of people's wealth, and a lot of people weren't happy about that. So the amicable grant directly causes discontent and a degree of rebellion. Another example of taxation playing a role in causing a rebellion is the Pilgrimage of Grace. Now, the Pilgrimage of Grace is probably the most complicated of the rebellions. It has multiple causes feeding into it. But the articles drawn up by the rebels when they were making their demands and explaining why they were rebelling, it did include an objection to the Subsidy Act of 1534. This tax was, again, and this seems to be an ongoing thing, was an unusual tax in that it was a peacetime tax. So a tax that is raised to pay for a war, people might not like it, but they essentially know it's coming. So when you get Yorkshire and Cornwall, they kind of go, we're raising a tax for a war, but that war isn't relevant to us, or we shouldn't be asked to pay for that war. With the amicable grant, you've got people going, well, you didn't ask Parliament, so you've not done it right. In this time, it's kind of like, well, taxes to pay for wars, you're not a war. Why are you taxing us? And there was a rumour that this was just the start, and there was going to be more taxes to come, and this idea of the king's ministers, in particular Cromwell, trying to snatch wealth from the people, and this was linked into the idea of the snatching wealth from the church. The Western Rebellion of 1549 is also referred to as the Prayer Book Rebellion. So obviously religion is a big issue for it, but it's also linked to the Subsidy Act of 1549 that taxed sheep and wool. And its aim was to move land back into growing crops and also to raise money, which was in short supply. Now, the West, places like Devon had a kind of a large amount of sheep farming. And so this is a clear factor in this rebellion on top of the religious concerns. Enclosure and engrossment are also major issues at this period in time. Now enclosure is when land is surrounded by a hedge or a fence or a ditch to separate it off for the sole use of an individual landowner. Now, sometimes this was done legally, and this was absolutely all the person's land, and actually in that case it's quite a good advancement of farming. And you'll notice if you travel through the English countryside that you will see all the fields kind of hedged or fenced off. There was some enclosure that was illegal, where the land that was fenced off was disputed. There was bits where enclosing stopped people accessing land. There was particularly things that caused particular problems with things like enclosing of common land. We also saw a growth in something called engrossment, and this is when 2 or more farms are combined and enclosed together, and so this is more efficient. And these large farms could generate and made the gentry or the nobility or whoever owned them very, very wealthy. But in being more efficient, they required fewer labourers, and therefore this caused discontent in areas because it caused unemployment. And with no welfare state like we have today, unemployment was a desperate situation for people to be in. So stopping people accessing land they'd been previously able to caused upset. Common land being enclosed caused a problem, and it all plays a massive role in changing the way society works and the roles that people had and what people were used to happening. And generally speaking, people don't like change. So not many people who from the labouring classes are going to be sat around going, oh well, yes, but I do think actually this is going to be a jolly good advancement of for agriculture, and will help the growth emotionally of food growing and feed the towns. They're going to going, I used to be able to go on that bit of land and now I can't because it was really important for me gathering this kind of food or for grazing my animals, and I used to have a work here, and I used to have to be able to work on doing strip farming and growing my crops here. Now I can't, and it's been and they don't need as many workers, or they filled it full of sheep or whatever it is, and therefore this causes discontent and potentially rebellion. So these are important and big issues. They are particularly strongly linked to Kett's rebellion in 1549, and this is arguably it's primarily caused by illegal enclosure by Norfolk landowners. Kett seems to be quite clever about this. To me, he actually took his own fences down before the mob turned up and took them down. Then joined the rioters. Then ended up leading the rioters and protesting against enclosure. There was protests similar to this elsewhere in England, but it was only in Norfolk that it turned into full-blown rebellion. This seems to, as I mentioned earlier, the idea of local issues. There seems to be something particular about the behaviour and the relationship between the landed classes in Norfolk with the ordinary people that meant there was a particularly high level of tension at this point in 1549. Kett and the rebels actually believed the king and the government would take their side and act against the landowners who were enclosing land. Largely because a lot of the enclosure that was happening was illegal. Not all enclosure was opposed. So, for example, there was enclosure that was done to protect fields of saffron, which was a very valuable crop, and so you didn't want other people's sheep getting in there and eating the saffron, and saffron is used as a dye. So it wasn't absolutely all enclosure they objected to. It was enclosure in certain places that was stopping people functioning economically and socially as they had done before. And we see again this much later on, 1596, we see the Oxfordshire Rebellion, which is a tiny little rebellion, but it's a sign of the discontent at this period of time. And again, this links directly to the government actually lifting some anti-enclosure laws that it had brought in, and this then led to common land being fenced off and fed into the rebellion that took place. Inflation is another important issue. Now, inflation measures how quickly prices are rising. It can be created by shortages of goods. So if there's not enough goods, and so the money is chasing, you've got lots of money chasing not very many goods, then that pushes prices up. It can be high demand. So if lots of people want something, then you'll notice the price on it will go up. Or it can be just a shortage of money. There's just not enough money in circulation. Now, you have to remember at this point in time, Tudor world, we're working in coinage, and these are coins with precious metals in them. So just producing more of them is more difficult than it would be, say, in the modern world. We just go, well, just print more of it. If there's not enough money in circulation, let's just print more. And shortage of money would cause really high prices. Now, all of these causes combined in the Tudor period at different times. So inflation is a real problem. Now, there were some people who benefited from inflation. So landowners, investors, speculators in particular benefited from inflation. You buy some church land, for example, hold on to it, a few years later it's worth a lot more as food prices and things go up. But anybody on a wage, labourers, tenant farmers who would see their rents rapidly increasing, were very badly affected, because wages generally through the Tudor period did not keep up with the increases in prices. And there's lots of statistics and things available on that, which is again some of the stuff you should look into in terms of your research. And so as food and rent are going up more rapidly than wages, then the ordinary people are suffering, and therefore rebellions and discontent are fed by inflation. So it plays a role in the Pilgrimage of Grace, where it can be seen that there was a former mechanism for helping the poor when they couldn't afford to feed themselves, etc., which was run through the monasteries. The Pilgrimage of Grace is about trying to save those monasteries which are being dissolved by Henry's government. So these bits are all kind of interlinking. There are some periods of real suffering in the Tudor period, and discontent and rebellion could be closely linked to hardship, notably when there's years of poor harvest or outbreak of disease. The Oxford Rising can be linked to the poor harvest and famine that was occurring. There were food riots in 1586. There were food riots in 1595 and 96, and that all links to poor harvests. There were poor harvests in the reign of Edward, 1549, all the way 1550, 1551, and all of that can be seen to play a role in the discontent and the rebellion that we see under Edward. And 1549 is often referred to as the worst year in Tudor England because of the level of discontent, and so you could link that in. Well, why is there discontent? Well, the people are unhappy because they're hungry. If we go back to a different time period, if you think back to ancient Rome, there was an old adage about how do you keep the people of Rome happy, and there was two simple things that you needed. It was bread and circuses. So they needed to be entertained and they needed to be fed. Well, in this case, we're just looking at the need for them to be fed. An unhappy, a starving population is likely to be one that is going to turn on the people who are in charge. Now, that is more true in a urban society. Now, England at this point in time was not an urban society, so you might get some discontent in the towns, but since most people worked in the countryside where the food was grown, then it was probably less of a connection. But also there are some other stuff that we need to think about in terms of this. When people are starving and suffering from disease or sickness, so we got things like the plague or the sweating sickness that swept through England during this point, and we have some years with some incredibly high death rates. Well, starving and ill people don't make very effective rebels, so we actually see sometimes some of the biggest rebellions actually coincide with good harvests. So the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536, the Northern Rebellion in 1569. So common sense would say the people are hungry and unhappy and starving or ill, they're going to turn on the landowners, they're going to turn on the government. But actually, for the ordinary people, sometimes they were too weak, too poor to do much about it. And really, for rebellions to be highly effective, they needed leadership. Leadership normally came from the landowning classes, and at times of low yield harvests, and landowners tended to benefit from that because the food then sold for ridiculously high prices, which links back to the stuff we talked about before with inflation. So they sold less food, but they sold it at a much higher price, so they weren't badly affected, and so they were unlikely to rebel because they were seeing rising prices and life was pretty good. And without that leadership and that connection between the different classes, the rebellions were less likely to be effective. Social issues are significant in all of this. So if there is a tension between the classes, that played a role in some of the rebellions, notably when it's between the landowning classes and the poorer classes, and we see this in the Pilgrimage of Grace, where something called rack renting, where rents are dramatically increased at the end of a lease, that was one of the things that was causing tension, because it was seen as the landowners exploiting the situation, taking advantage of the poor. And so that's one of the things that in Ask's set of demands that are complained about. Kett's rebellion is often seen as close to we get to as class war in this period of history, and there were complaints over increased rents. Something called Castle Ward, which was a feudal due that was to do with defending the castle, where people had to actually physically defend the castle for a period of time, but by this stage it had advanced into having to make a payment. So this is again a very local thing about a complaint of the poor. And there was enclosure, and it tended to be that it's the landowners who are enclosing, it's the labouring classes that are ruling out. And in this, Kett is quite, and his men are quite clearly asking for the king to pull the local nobility and gentry back into line. So they're clashing with the class just above them, the classes above them in the locality. They aren't worried about overall kind of changing the whole system as a whole and getting rid of the king. They just believe that there are rules in place that should protect them, and that the local gentry aren't abiding by them. The Western Rebellion also saw a resentment of the gentry, who the local people saw buying church land and becoming richer, whilst they suffered due to high food prices and new taxes. And this rise of the gentry is an important part of the social change in Tudor England. So we see new classes emerge. So we see gentry, we see a middle class emerging, and what we also start to see is some of the security that had been there at the bottom, particularly when labour had been in enormously short supply, started to go away, and so we start getting this increasing gap between rich and poor. So there were some real radicals around at the time. They don't tend to completely dominate, control the rebellions, but during the rebellions of 1549, there was some talk and demands to kill all gentlemen. So we really are looking at the idea of class war at that point. But maybe it's important not to overestimate that. I hope that's been useful for you in terms of looking at this theme within a coursework essay, looking at the causes of Tudor rebellion, and given some examples at the various points. Of course, as this is coursework, what you really need to then do is you need to build on this and go and do some further research. If it's been helpful, then please hit like and share it with anybody else you think might find it useful. If you haven't done so already, then please do subscribe and have a look at my NEA coursework playlist, which has got more about how to do coursework and more stuff linked to this particular question, but also stuff on other questions as well, notably a question on anti-Semitism in Germany. And there are also a whole other range of playlists looking at a whole range of different history topics, and some of it British, some American unit, and also a Russian one. So there's a whole range of stuff that can hopefully be helpful to you, as well as a large playlist looking at all aspects of A-level politics. Again, thank you very much for watching.